Welcome to Lancefield on the Line. My name is David Lancefield. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Art Kleiner and Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz to the show. Art is a consulting editor and author, and Jeffrey is a research psychiatrist. Together, along with Josie Thompson, they are the author of the book, The Wise Advocate, The Inner Voice of Strategic Leadership. I have it right here. And I've read it multiple times. And every time I read it, I learn something new. And I consider myself a student today. Both are brilliant men. You're also partners in Wise Advocates Enterprises, and you're also authors of other seminal works. Welcome to the show. Welcome to you from California and Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
That's correct, David. Thank you. Hello.
Thank you. So let's dive straight in. Let's talk about transactional leadership and strategic leadership. What's the difference between those two concepts in both from the neuroscientist perspective and a management perspective?
Okay, I'll just take it from the neuroscience, and then I'll hand it over to Art for the management. We did actually in the model in the Wise Advocate base a management strategic transactional terminology on a neuroscience foundation. Over the last 20 years or so, one of the major things that's come out of brain imaging of relevance to this is that the so-called medial prefrontal cortex, which is actually sits right in the midline. There's one on the left and one on the right of the very front, sort of right behind your forehead kind of a thing. The lower part of that, which there leads to us calling transactional leadership low ground, that part of the brain, the medial, the lower or ventral medial prefrontal cortex gets activated around subject matter having to do with the neuroscience, but also economics relevant terms, subjective valuation, which simply means subject matter that is viewed by the person as valuable to them, as something they want. And that area of the brain gets activated both by subject matter that a person wants and that what a person views as other people wanting.
Yes.
So this area, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, transactional leadership related to what we call low ground leadership. Not that that's bad, as you'll see, but because it's the lower part of the medial prefrontal cortex. So low ground, what you want, transactional. Above that, more towards the top of the head, the so-called dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which sits above that, is a major advance of the last 15 years has been the discovery that this part of the brain gets activated by questions having to do with thinking about what others are thinking, sometimes called theory of mind, but now more frequently called mentalising. So it's related to thinking about what others are thinking and thinking about what others are going to do. And so we basically use the term strategic leadership to be at a tactical level of being sort of the tactics of strategy, you might call it, thinking about what others are thinking and thinking about what they're going to do. And then the whole prefrontal around the outer part, from the medial to the lateral prefrontal cortex, has long been known as what's called the executive brain.
Yes.
And executive is very important because it's the one word that is really shared by management, business, and neuroscience, and means the same thing in all of those contexts and is widely used in all of those terminology. And that terminology is widely used in both management, business, and neuroscience in the same way. And basically, the most simple way to describe it is long-term planning. And that part of the brain, the executive brain, the lateral prefrontal cortex, is related to keeping your attention on long-term plans and goals. Yeah. So we have lower medial, what people want, subjective valuation, transactional. Above that, dorsomedial, what are people thinking? What are they going to do to get what they want? Strategic. And then it's all done in the service of executive long-term plans and goals and keeping your attention on long-term plans and goals.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Art, as you cover this sort of management, although obviously Jeffrey's covered quite a lot of that already, I'm fascinated with, if you like, the mixing, if you like, of the two, of the low ground and high ground, because leaders need to do both, right? And also
Absolutely.
perhaps you can talk about why is, if you like, expediency as well.
Certainly. Well, so, and first of all, as somebody who's worked with and in large organizations, you know very well how much the quality of thinking of the individual leader makes a difference. We like to think that we can sort of plug anybody into a role, but what their inner life and their way of solving problems, their way of addressing issues, their way of making decisions, it ripples out, to people who work with them, people who transact with them. So it really matters the way people think and the habits that they develop about thinking. And so, Jeff, what you just sort of said, I sometimes think of as the kind of two habitual ways that one could approach a decision. You can approach it tactically, and I'm going to give people what they want. Let me clear off my desk because that's what I want. I'm going to make a deal because everybody wants a good deal. And I'm going to figure out what my boss wants, and I'm going to satisfy it in the shortest possible time. And that will often work. That's what business people need to do. They need to make good deals. But they also need to look out in the long run for what's going to be the right thing for customers, for shareholders, for employees, for every constituent they have, for, to the extent that they interact with society around them, for society as a whole, and for themselves and their own sense of integrity. And so you need that kind of dorsal or executive element. You need to be thinking, what are my long-term plans and goals, and how am I going to address them? And we all know that when somebody is capable of acting and thinking that way, that people gravitate to them. They have gravitas. They have that executive quality. And I think what we discovered in The Wise Advocate and the work leading up to it, and the research that you've done, Jeff, and in our sort of management insights, we've discovered that you can learn to be more strategic. You can cultivate the habits, the day-to-day habits that will allow you to make decisions in that way. And along the way, you learn, you need both. You need, you're never going to make a purely strategic decision. There's always going to be some consideration of who's going to get paid, how much they're going to get paid, what you're trading for what.
There's always got to be a mix, right, Art? There's always got to be a mix of the two. It's felt like there's been a lot of transactional leadership in business. I won't even go there on politics. I'm afraid that's too delicate for a topic, especially given the countries we're residents in. But you need a mix of both, right? But how do you I know it's context specific, and obviously the nature of this, if you like, the CEO role is very different if you're in a family business versus a listed company. But I see a lot of transactional leaders who talk about strategic leadership, but I would argue don't practice enough of it. So how do you talked about how do you actually, if you like, build, this is the wrong term, so forgive me, how do you build your muscle? How do you practice?
Well, no, build a muscle is not the wrong term. Okay, so that's why I wasn't going to use it, but it's okay, because I was going to immediately go to the Wise Advocate, but because obviously we believe the Wise Advocate is this inner voice that you can consult to get you to make wise decisions about how to combine and when not to combine transactional and strategic. I mean, when to go more purely strategic, when to go more purely transactional, and when to really be in the area you mentioned, which we coined the term wise expedience, to be sort of literally combining what people want with what they're thinking, what they're going to do, with long-term plans and goals. Now, the reason why exercise or muscle building is relevant is because we do use a breath awareness exercise, and this brings in the term mindfulness, and we do use the Wise Advocate as basically what we feel is an updated, but in some ways actually more traditional use in many ways, a more traditional use of the word mindfulness, because the word mindfulness, as it's been used in business, has been pared down
Yes.
from its traditional use. And it's the critical point here is that in its traditional use, mindfulness has always been viewed as being very concerned with making assessments and discernments about the thoughts, feelings, responses that you're having. So mindfulness is being aware. Mindfulness is basically having an outer perspective on your inner experience. I like to call it a third person perspective on your first person experience. Adam Smith used the term impartial spectator in his book that both preceded and followed The Wealth of Nations, because he wrote a first Wealth of Nations and then finished his career with a radical updating of the theory of moral sentiments to really accentuate the role of the impartial spectator. The impartial spectator is the term from whence we got the wise advocate. So mindfulness has a strong tradition in the economics of free enterprise, because it's very significantly related to what Adam Smith called the impartial spectator, this capacity to observe with an impartial perspective what you are thinking, feeling, how you're reacting. And then the key that we want to stress is that you can consult your inner guide, your wise advocate, to make assessments and discernments about which level your inner experience is relevant to. Is it more relevant to a low ground, win-win, close the deal perspective? Is it more relevant to a what are people thinking? What are they going to do? You know, what are our long-term plans and goals? How do we combine those? How do we switch moment to moment from one to the other as may be called for? And the big point is that we're not going to do it, but there is a breath awareness exercise that literally builds the muscle of your executive brain. And there's a lot of research. The last 20 years, there has been a very good scientific foundation built showing that doing directed, focused attention exercises enhances executive brain function. And in that way, you actually can think of it as an exercise that builds, as it were, a cognitive muscle. And then you can enhance that even further with connecting to the wise advocate, becoming in touch with your inner voice, using the impartial spectator effectively to see what your internal process is. And what we like to say is we want leaders at the upper echelons of strategic leadership to be mentalizing about themselves. And we call that applied mindfulness at the upper regions of strategic leadership. So you're not just mentalizing about others, because all leaders do that. You have to do that. But not enough leaders literally mentalize about themselves and literally ask the question with an impartial spectator, wise advocate perspective. What am I thinking? What am I going to do? Why am I doing it? Is it consistent with my long-term plans and goals? So mentalizing about yourself is really the core of what we call applied mindfulness, and puts you in touch with the wise advocate, which then helps you make choices about where you want to be: transactional, strategic, or upper echelons, and even towards transformational. We don't like to talk about too much, because that's where real controversy occurs at the level of transformational leadership. You get
we may come back to that if we have time. That you'd think in the world we live in, which has genuine complexity and uncertainty at a level we haven't seen for many years, that the practice you talk about there is more needed than ever. Well, not ever, but for a long time at least.
In our lifetime. I think in our lifetime is a fair statement.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I mean, Art, one thing I'm struck by is, you know, yes, how do you build that muscle, as Jeffrey was talking about? How do you find your inner voice? How do you practice it? And in a way, I'm curious actually, how much of that is down to the amount of experience? Because we often see CEOs, for example, of a certain age, particularly in corporations, and they've had experience, ups and downs of their corporate life, and no doubt their personal life as well. But there are a lot of businesses, as we know, who are founder-led businesses where the CEO, the leader, is much younger in age. So I'm curious about how, bluntly, are there 20, without being ageist, are there 20 and 30-year-old people who can be both, very effective in both using both the high ground and the low ground, or is it something that comes with experience?
Well, it certainly comes with experience. And there is a long tradition in leadership literature of, just writing about people who have been tested in one way or another.
Yes.
A lot of times this is associated with maturity. There's a whole tradition of the reflective leader, the collaborative leader, the open leader, the servant leader. All of these, in some ways, are efforts to recognize people who bring a certain amount of thoughtfulness, a willingness to listen. If you're willing to listen to your inner voice will often preach humility, right? I mean, you're seeing yourself as others might see you, as you might see others. You're compassionate about yourself. You know that you are standing in a place where other people depend on you. And so you know that being a loose cannon is generally not going to work. There are exceptions. There are exceptions, that then it comes back to haunt you. And you ultimately know that you're responsible for an enterprise that's larger than just your own short-term needs. So you develop, you find that out the hard way, typically.
Yes.
Many of us do. Many of the people that, we've interviewed talk about, basically failure as something that they had to endure and go through in order to come out the other end. And they come out the other end in part because they have the resources of a voice that is not just other people talking to them, but that is helping them discern, as you said, Jeff, what to pay attention to and how to build the focus that they need. When that happens, it's not like there's hard and fast rules. There's some people who, and it's not like everybody needs, adversity of the same sort. But you can, but it becomes clear when you don't have it that you're going to need it. And it becomes clear to other people around you as well. And being in a position of responsibility takes your measure.
It's a classic. So just to interject, there's a classic, I guess, parallel to that is where lots of, a lot of literature and practice around disruptive innovation, where effectively, I guess, a low ground perspective would encourage you to keep, inverted commas, exploiting what you're doing, rather than the exploration you would have with a sort of high ground, perspective, which at the time can deliver lots of, short-term results, depending on your tenure and your reward package, but actually over a longer time period can actually signal your demise. So that's been a popular literature that obviously this plays into.
And I'm just going to say, look, this is short, and I'll keep it really short. And I will just say there's a bit of an editorial comment, but I'm going to say this. I mean, if you talk about disruptive leadership, I mean, if we look at, and then you said 20s and 30s, which immediately is going to make everybody think of the leadership of, the high powered technology. We know that high powered technology has had significant leadership in the younger age group. And let's just simply say that actually a lot of that leadership has been the epitome of highly effective low ground leadership. They've been extremely good at discerning what people want. Now, in recent days, they've been trying to demonstrate, their view of how to do, the high ground version, not very effectively. That's where my editorial comment comes in, making blunders that are going to have tremendous long-term implications. That's also my editorial perspective. So it just shows you that even the world itself now, even the most powerful leaders in business, the leaders of the corporations that have the highest market value right now, need some catch up on the high ground strategic leadership, long-term plans and goals, what's really going to be best in the long term. perspective, because their exceedingly successful approach to low ground
Yeah.
perspective has given them power that they haven't been using wisely.
No, I take that point. So let's continue that theme then. If one of those individuals, whether it is those tech companies or another individual who's has that character you just described, comes to one of you or both of you and says, you know what, it's all going wrong. I'm not sure. I'm too much low ground. I've heard of you. I've read your book. Where do I start? How do I change? What would you say to him or her?
It's a great question. And when I was at the Whole Earth Catalog in the 80s, that was the first generation of these young, very young CEOs. And I remember, and I was about the same age myself, so it wasn't like I had, sort of the experience that, or the knowledge that I've gained from working with Jeff and Josie and others. But I remember being asked over to this young company called Atari, and they wanted us to tell them what would a home computer, what they inherited this company. Nolan Bushnell had been thrown out for his own lack of a wise advocate, I guess, and they wanted to know, what's a home computer? What should we be making? We've inherited it. It has a business, and I was startled at the time by how many of these companies are sort of like roller coasters that people get on, and they get up to a peak, and then it's like they're looking over the edge,
Yep.
and they haven't really steered themselves there, and now they're now they're going to be on a ride that they don't really know how to follow. I think Silicon Valley has gotten smarter than that. People have learned since then. But I also think, as you said, Jeff, there's a lot of people who, the stakes have gotten even higher since then. There weren't companies knitting the world together and, essentially becoming oligopolies or dominant in such a strong way. And I would, it would be pointless to say, look at yourself as others see you, because others are seeing them. I mean, they're getting criticism from all around. I think the thing that we could say is that the capability for managing this feels unfamiliar from what you have done.
Yep.
And the practices for doing it are probably different than what you're used to doing, even if you think you're already doing mindfulness, even if you
Yes.
think you're already doing
So they've
mentalizing.
got to learn planning. They've got to learn some new capabilities. They've got to practice what you talked about in the book extensively. You have
Well, they
chapters
have,
associated.
I'm happy,
The
Art,
they
that
have one,
relabeling, the reframing, the refocusing. They've got to do all of it, right?
right. And part of the problem, I'm not going to overstate this, but because some of these companies, I mean, Google, we know, has brought a lot of on-campus mindfulness, but it's not the traditional mindfulness of making assessments and discernments about especially what is genuinely wholesome, what is more unwholesome, what is more related just to what you want, what is more related really to the long-term plans and goals, not just but all the millions of people who are using your services. So this shallow understanding of mindfulness, which puts an excessive stress on calmness. Calmness is very important, but it's not mindfulness. And there's been this conflation of being calm and focusing on your task and being in the present moment and being non-judgmental is mindfulness. That's false. That's simply false. And some of the bigger names, which I'll leave unmentioned in the mindfulness field, who let that pass for a couple of decades, I know from personal conversations, regret that they let it pass as long as they did, because it is simply not true that being non-judgmental in the present moment is mindfulness.
Yeah.
That is false. And so we coined the wise advocate term to bring into the mindfulness, back in to the mindfulness concept, the original notion that the primary function of mindfulness is, yes, being in the present moment and being aware of what you're thinking and being transparent and honest with yourself, and then literally making third person, impartial spectator, wise advocate assessments and discernments on what the real long-term implications of what you're thinking and what you're doing are going to be. It's
Yes,
not just being non-judgmental, it's
understand.
making assessments and discernments in the
I
present
understand
moment.
that.
That's what mindfulness is.
So
And
imagine,
and
Art, did you want to come in?
yeah, let me come in and say the 4 steps that we talk about are a kind of practiced way of making that habitual. Looking for, the deceptive messages that arise, recognizing them as deceptive messages in your organization's culture and in your own thoughts, where we can do anything we want,
Hmm.
or conversely, we're going to fail, whatever they may be, and then reframing them, being deliberate about what a wholesome message might be for us and our company, and then repeating that, and then sort of bringing it to life and continually revisiting it. Oddly enough, here's my editorial comment.
Hmm.
Google's original, the message that Google got famous for, don't be evil, was their probably naive effort to do exactly that, to kind of say, we're not going to fall into the same traps that other companies fall into.
Hmm.
But it it takes discernment, and it takes a little definition about what evil is. And there's a lot of things, when you go down this road, there are points at which you say, there are things we're not going to do.
Hmm.
And if we're worried that others will do them even if we don't do them, then we're going to find ways to set a context where our industry is doing the right thing. And sometimes, if we're not sure what the right thing is, if we know there are unintended consequences to something like artificial intelligence, and we don't fully know what they are, we're going to set up the practices that build
Yes.
awareness in ourselves and everyone else for how to do that. Are companies doing it? I think they're doing it more than you would guess, but are they doing it enough?
And
Probably
it's
not.
how do you, in a way, it's how do you, as you say, do it consistently, and if you like to use the term, scale it. So it's not just an activity that an enlightened individual does. It has to be a practice that you talked about, has to go across the organization in terms of building that the muscle. Um, I'm I'm struck at the moment talking to a number of executives, public sector, private sector. Um, Perhaps they're being optimistic, but they are thinking about the world beyond the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I guess the question that prompts is, given all of your research and practice in this area, what do you think should be on their agenda that's perhaps new as a result of the experience that they might have had during the pandemic, whether that's personal or professional? But we've just had a big shock to the system in many different facets. You've done a huge amount of research on neuroscience. If you are going to talk to an executive leader saying, okay, I'm now planning the next, perhaps it's 2022, who knows, 2022 and beyond, what are the things they should be thinking about now based on your research into neuroscience and the application of it?
Well,
Either of you.
okay, it's interesting to frame it that way, because I am definitely a neuroscientist, and in our current culture, I'm a pretty small minority of a neuroscientist who will openly say that I do not believe that neuroscience has even almost all the answers to these kinds of questions. And neuroscience is very good for understanding the structure of cognition, and neuroscience is very good for understanding what parts of your brain, which you can view it as a machine, I suppose. I don't think that, I think that model is breaking down, and even when you start thinking of it as a quantum machine, which from my perspective you have to do, it brings in intrinsically this role of the observer. I mean, it's not, the brain is not a machine that is necessarily running itself. And if you forget the observer, it will become a machine running itself, and then you'll be an animal, because
Yeah.
that's really what an animal is. an animal is a machine that the machine is running everything. And so to get out of the trap of thinking that neuroscience in and of itself has the answers, it's one of the reasons that I take the concept, and I'll openly say, myself, Art, Josie, we actually have three not entirely overlapping views of what the wise advocate is.
Yeah.
So once you start talking about your inner loving guide, or that your inner guide that is aiding you to make assessments and discernments, we're going to openly acknowledge. And one of the reasons I said briefly at the beginning that at the level of transformational, where you're really, really in touch with the wise advocate, that's also the area that civil wars happen at. I mean, and obviously we have to remember that too. So transformational, one thing I think we've learned is that transformational is anything but a glib term. Because right now there are things going on in the world where people are trying to transform things in a way that, a good half of the population is willing to die to prevent. And so both of these, leaders, as it were, on opposite sides, to some degree, are consulting their wise advocate.
Yes,
So,
yes.
so we need to have a wise advocate concept that takes into account the differences in perspective. And I think that at the level of large business leadership, we need more attention being paid to the fact that we're losing touch with our historical connection to what the free enterprise system is. I mean, I'll literally say, go back and read Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. It will very much help you be in a very Western, free enterprise friendly way in better understanding of what the impartial spectator wise advocate is, and that what we need to do is protect the freedom that allowed us to become the countries that we have become, and that we're losing that context in very, very dangerous ways.
So,
Wow, that's quite something. Well, that's certainly a book list recommendation for 2021, which I will commend to my clients. Art, what's your take on that question?
so Jeff you voiced the half empty perspective, and let me try the cup half full perspective. There's and I think there's reason to ascribe to a variety of perspectives. At heart, every business person, every business idea is a transgression of some sort, because if it weren't, it wouldn't be successful. You're doing something, offering something that nobody else has offered before, even if it's in a region that they haven't gone into before. You're taking you're providing something that others haven't had. And when you overreach or overstep, it can have tremendous consequences for your business, for yourself, and for the world at large. And when different people have different worldviews, there are different wise advocates telling them different things, there are legitimate reasons to be concerned. And business by its nature is an inclusive enterprise. You don't want to do anything that would prevent you from having customers. So you try to be as broad as you can. There are exceptions, but most businesses really want to be inclusive at the same time. And every business wants to be unfettered, so it can do the things that it feels it wants to do and needs to do. At the same time, every business is also a community. And therefore, every leader of a business unit, of a function, of an enterprise, of a company, is concerned about the people that they care about and whether they'll be on board. And there's a limit to which you can invite people to consult their wise advocate, to be thoughtful, to be reflective, to forgive, to be soulful, in whatever way you want to use the word soulful. You can invite people to do that, but a company that does livelihood can't force people to be soulful.
Yes, yes.
And yet our thriving depends on it. That, in a way, is the nut we're trying to crack. How do we live in a pluralistic society and a moral society at the same time? And The answer, the cup half full part is people do have more resources to manage this, more capability to step up than we typically give ourselves credit for. And we have to find that in ourselves and in the people we work with.
Well, that's a great way to close. This has been a stimulating, provocative, enlightening conversation full of wisdom. I'm incredibly grateful for your time. This was another edition of Lancefielder on the Line. Thank you to Jeffrey, thank you to Art, and thank you again.